Judge, the evidence in this case is graphic and it's disturbing. What happened to Laken Riley is graphic and disturbing, and it is a tragedy. The loss of any life that young and apparently full of promise is a tragedy. And I'm sorry that the family is having to go through this and be here for the presentation of this evidence. People have used this case for their own personal gain, financial gain, political gain. And while this process has its place for testing evidence, it's very poorly suited to healing hearts and minds. So it's the evidence that we have to talk about. And the evidence in this case is very good that Laken Riley was murdered. The evidence that Jose Ibarra killed Laken Riley is circumstantial. The evidence that anyone had any intent or certainly committed any sexual assault is speculation. Most importantly, in this case, you'll hear no evidence that a sexual assault was committed. You'll hear nothing from the GBI, the FBI, UGAPD, ACCPD, that after looking at all of the evidence in this case, scouring for anything that could help prove this allegation in the state's indictment, that they found any biological evidence that would suggest that, any physical evidence that would suggest that. There's no injuries that are consistent with a sexual assault. And in this case, it's an effort to explain a tragedy, but it's not based on evidence. The evidence that Jose Ibarra killed anyone is circumstantial. The state's presentation in their opening had a lot of detail about information, again, that showed that this event happened. But upon a closer look at the evidence that links Mr. Ibarra to that event, it is lacking. You'll hear that his phone was in the area, and you'll hear that the cast team that ran the locations of this phone. And there is good evidence that the phone itself was in the area. What you'll also hear, though, is that when they looked into this phone, when they did a close examination of who was using this phone, it wasn't just Jose Ibarra. It was other people in that apartment who were using this phone. And that comes through an investigation into the accounts that were used through this phone, and also from people who met other people associated with this phone who had used the phone to message people. And so while the phone was there, that's true. It doesn't show that Mr. Ibarra was there. And you'll hear that Mr. Ibarra's fingerprint was on Laken Riley's phone. But you'll also hear that he was wearing gloves, supposedly. And that this hole that was supposedly in the gloves that they found would not have left that mark. you'll hear that someone in that video, in the so-called dumpster video, was wearing an Adidas hat. That's true. When they find that hat, and specifically the hat that was tested in this case, it was worn by Diego Ibarra, not Jose Ibarra, Diego Ibarra. And you'll also hear, and the state will ask you to consider different types of forensic evidence and to suspend your understanding of how that evidence is evaluated. Because while they will say that Mr. Ibarra's DNA was present at the scene, what they'll tell you is that without this software that we can't test, this proprietary software used by the GBI, without that, their expert wouldn't have been able to say whose DNA it was. She wouldn't have been qualified to testify about whose DNA that is. So they have to use a machine. And they're going to ask you to trust that machine where the human being isn't good enough. But with this fingerprint, they're going to ask you to trust a person because a machine isn't good enough. When they run those fingerprints through the database of fingerprints where they know Mr. Ibarra's fingerprint is, it doesn't come up. And so while a machine is good enough in one situation to try to convict Mr. Ibarra, it's not good enough in another. And it's this kind of gymnastics that it will take to tell the story with this circumstantial evidence. We waived a jury trial in this case with the hope and trust that despite the nature of this evidence, that you could come to a verdict that was not just a way of easing this family's suffering, but it was based on an impartial and honest assessment of the evidence in this case. If that happens and the presumption of innocence is respected, there should not be enough evidence to convince you beyond a reasonable doubt that Mr. Ibarra is guilty of the crimes charged.